Hello and welcome to The Found Cause, where we found our cause and serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my I'm always going to mess it up, my actual, literal left. On your screen, it's left. Is?
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
Hey, Sebastian, what's going on?
Not much, Michael. Just been pretty angry recently.
Angry, huh? Yeah, I think we all are. Why are you angry? What are you doing about it?
Rent's too just freaking high.
No swearing on this podcast. Thank you for censoring yourself there. You're talking about that New York guy? That old 2008 guy said rent is just too dang high. Join the movement.
Yes. It's just too much. Too much to bear. I should just go outside and start protesting, start a riot. It's just too much. Abolish rent. That's what I'm going to do.
That seems a little drastic. What gives you the right to do that, huh?
God does.
All right. Well, you could have cut it right there and gotten arrested or something. So that's our intro. That's not really what our opinions are. This episode is on tyrannical government. When we decide that enough is enough and we gotta protest in the streets, and when we should put up with it. And I think every church worth its donuts in the back has probably already done a sermon like this at some point this year, considering the COVID lockdowns and all the protesting going on. I think Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, is that what it is? Have both been referenced like a million times, a bunch of different churches. So I'm sure if you're a church-going Christian, you've already heard this, not just from your church, but also from many other Christian commentators. So we're not the first to do something like this. And before COVID or anything else, we've also talked about righteous government and our thoughts on how we apply biblical law to government today, and why we think that the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are underused and underappreciated by Christians today, on how it can teach us what a government that is godly looks like. But putting all that aside, we want to piggyback off of all the trend that's going on and do an episode on tyrannical government, maybe because the trend has also started to die down. Maybe that's false, but still protests going on and the lockdowns are still on. But I think it's been so done talking about tyrannical government that most of people have gotten this out of the system. So here's your up on tyrannical government. So I want to discuss a little bit different, hopefully a little bit unique in this episode here. We're going to go through 4 things. First of all, what does tyrannical government look like? What qualifies something as tyrannical? And maybe some historical examples of governments being tyrannical in the past that you can tell, okay, that's tyrannical and that's not. Secondly, we want to go over the Bible and how it supports the American concept of limited government. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because America thinks we originated everything, but I would say the Bible is the origination of the reasoning, and the Founding Fathers would too, for limited government. And so I just want to walk that through. I also, on the flip side, then point 3 is to take a look at the U.S. Constitution and the laws we have here in the U.S. and look how they badly compare to biblical laws, so where the U.S. actually falls short, even in our founding documents, to biblical law. And then finally, what do we do about all this? Do we just talk the talk and talk about what a tyrannical government is? Do we put on our bike helmets and pool goggles and face masks and go and light up a Wendy's? Yeah, because the rent is too high, No, the answer would be no, but we're gonna talk it through. So first things first, let's talk about when in history, not just here in this country, but also throughout the world, have governments legitimately been tyrannical, and how does the Bible talk about how we should be submitting to governments? Do you want to do the classic, the 2 verses that have been talked about, I'm sure, in every church, just to get us started?
Sure. I have 1 Peter 2 right here in front of me, so might as well read it. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors, who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor.
And there you go. So, and do you have Romans 13 put up, or should I put some commentary on that? I think both of them are pretty similar. So that was from 1 Peter. So if you don't know, Peter's written by Peter. So it's one apostle's word. They're both the word of God. So it's Romans. Romans is from Paul. So you get just a different version of it.
And then from Paul, from Romans, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also where you pay your taxes, for authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Probably throw rent in there too.
Yeah, to your landlord, right?
What a shame.
Yes, it is a shame. So I'll go through the obvious, I think, on those two, and then maybe, Sebastian, you can talk about some of the caveats. So the obvious, and the ways you can see this can be misused, is the obvious here is that both apostles are saying, don't resist the government, right? We're not, though we are in the kingdom of God, and therefore we could argue we're not subject to the earthly authorities and principalities. You know, I'm not a citizen of these United States, or I'm not a citizen of the Roman Empire. I'm a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, and therefore, you know, I'm not paying rent, or I'm not obeying your laws because I'm part of the citizenry of heaven. You know, my king is God, no king but Christ, and therefore I'm going to disobey all your laws, and you can't put me to court rightfully because I'm not your citizen. These two apostles are, at the very least, telling you, no, that's not your right. In fact, be subject to all these governing authorities, because as Romans 13 says, no authority has been put in place without God's express permission. They've been put in place by God, therefore, and they can be righteous or unrighteous, but you are to submit to them nonetheless. So that's that. So those who want to rebel against the government because they believe they are Christian and therefore aren't given credence, or even past Christians. There's a group of people in the United States, and probably other places, but it's kind of semi-big in the United States, called sovereign citizens. And their opinion, their philosophy is that they are not, though they live in the United States, they are actually citizens of the world. And so they aren't subject to, for example, traffic laws, and therefore they don't put license plates in their cars, and they don't register themselves, they don't get driver's license, or they unregister license, other things like that. And they think that they are immune because the UN Human Rights Council says that everybody has the right to travel or something like that. And they whip out a bunch of laws from obscure places, both in the U.S. Constitution, but also like defunct laws of the U.S., like the Articles of Confederation, which is no longer applicable in the United States, and the UN, which nobody cares about the UN, especially for something like a traffic ticket. So these people will, not roll up their windows for cops and say they don't need a driver's license, and usually they end up getting arrested, and because they're resisting arrest and they don't have a driver's license. So they're rebelling against the law of the land, thinking that they're a sovereign citizen when they're actually not. They are part of a sovereign nation, sure, and if they're Christian, they're members of a sovereign royalty, right? We're all priests in the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. However, we are still to be subject to the authorities on earth, so we can't be a sovereign citizen as a Christian.
Mm-hmm. And why are we subject to the authorities on earth? Because as Reformed men here, we say that everything happening has happened in history, is happening now, and will happen, is under the full control and dominion of God. Mm-hmm. So, we watch a political channel called Visual Politique, English and Spanish. I like the Spanish one, but that's my preference.
The original, actually. For any of you U.S. people, I thought everything's in English, but no, the English is a transcript from the Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Fun fact.
Yeah, and for example, the latest episode, Belarus, this this really obscene and foolish man, the dictator there, present for who knows how, I don't remember exactly how many years, he's being overthrown. The amount of time that he was in power, even though he was clearly a wicked person, we would say was permitted by God. Mm-hmm. It's not, he just didn't randomly appear there. God permitted him to rule for all those years, and now that he's probably going to be overthrown, his end has come. So, likewise, that was a bad person. For a good example, someone that everyone likes. Someone that everyone likes. George Washington. I had to hold myself back. Let's
Hard
not
to pick a non-controversial person, but sure, George Washington.
Yeah, someone everyone admires because he was some would say he was a humble man. He didn't want to he want to be elected. He didn't want to rule. He didn't want any political party. So everyone likes him. Permitted by God to have the position that he held. So likewise, we would hold that is the reason why, because just as how we're subject to God and we respect his decisions on our lives, he also has made decisions on this earth of who is going to be in charge of nations and which nations exist actually, when it's time for nations to come, when it's time for them to go. That is why I think it's important. And another fun fact, I'm just going to throw it out there. I was just reading it here in the Greek, and it's the same word, subject, both in 1 Peter and in Paul. So under submission, under subject, under subordination, excuse me.
And similarly, you were pointing out before we got on the podcast that in 1 Peter it says, be subject to the emperor. Also, slaves be subject to their masters. It's the same subject word. Now, those are different relationships, slave to master and subject to emperor. You know, they're different relationships, but the same spirit in that a slave should be subject to an unrighteous and a righteous master, and therefore we should be subject to a unrighteous and righteous emperorship or kingship or presidentship or whatever, the government that rules over us.
Again, because God has decreed history, and thus for his purpose, even though if we can't see it now, like why was Lukashenko ruler of Belarus, he has placed that man there for this amount of time. So even though we cannot see why, we have to nonetheless. We're going to talk about when the limits come. When is that dividing line that you cross?
Yes, because we can all see this being misused, as I was starting to say at the very beginning before we got into this, that you could use it to say, well, the government says deny Jesus, so let's do it. And you could use these verses and say, well, we're to submit to governing authorities, and God has put them there, so let's obey them by killing my neighbor, whatever the government might ask you to do. That's just clearly we're not supposed to do that. We know from biblical example a couple of things. We know, first of all, that when the government asked the apostles, Peter and Paul both, to not speak the gospel, they did it anyways, right? And Peter explicitly says, we must obey God rather than men. So when God has commanded you to do something or to not do something, and the government says the opposite, well, we know where our actual loyalties lie. We will obey the government up until they disobey God. So whether that's the Babylonian government saying that Daniel couldn't, the Median government saying that Daniel couldn't pray. They had a period where they could only pray to Cyrus. They couldn't pray to any other god, including Yahweh. He made a public show. Note in Daniel, he doesn't just go into his private room and pray. He actually opens his windows and prays on the balcony before everyone to show that this was an unrighteous law and he was going to pray to the Lord anyways. Now, you guys could quote Jesus and say he shouldn't be doing it publicly, but it wasn't for the sake of getting praise. It was actually for the sake of pointing out that the king's law, he was passing a line that he shouldn't have. And that's why the wise men of King Darius were able to have him arrested, because he did it in public. Now we know Daniel did this righteously and was defended and protected from the punishment, because though you're supposed to submit to the governing authority, clearly this time the king had done something that was pushing past his authority. So we know two things. One, we're blanketly, defaultly supposed to submit to the government. And therefore we can't take the default stance that I won't submit to the government unless, some line. However, we know that there are limits to government, as exemplified not only by biblical characters but also by biblical law that we're going to discuss today. So probably the first things first, Sebastian. So we've gone over what the biblical mandate is for obeying the government. Now we should go over all the limits. So the rest of this episode is really going to be about what are the limits to not obeying the government. When would you not obey the government? And in history, this is not really a biblical word, but in history this is the word tyranny. Tyranny is the word to say that the government has overstepped its bounds. It has gone over the biblical bounds. If you're Western Europe, the English word for it means you've gone over the biblical bounds that are allowed to the king, and therefore you are a tyrant. And I think there's three kinds of tyranny that we could discuss and that you could qualify as tyranny. The first one is the most obvious, and we've just been talking about it. It's that if the government asks you to do something that is expressly forbidden or expressly commanded by God. So if they ask you not to share the gospel, or if they asked you to kill your neighbor. These things would be expressly against God, disobeying God, and therefore they are tyrannical, regardless of the laws of the land.
So asking you to sin.
Asking you to sin.
Mm-hmm.
And that one's easy. I think most Americans and people that are Christian in general don't have really a problem with defining that as a line, because, that's the line, all right? That's pretty obvious. I think when we think about, like, oh, would we deny Christ if somebody had a gun up to our head? That's the easy time not to deny Christ. Much harder to imagine yourself not denying Christ when maybe they just stack a 30% tax on you, more than what you have because you're a Christian, like the Muslim countries do. And
the jizya?
And they slowly eroded away at Christian support in those regions over decades and decades of, heavy tax on everyone. And eventually there wasn't so many Christians in there because they had left, because that's a harder choice to make than die. It was just submit via tax. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of tyranny, just straight sin. Are they asking you to sin? 2, and this one's where it gets more obscure. I think there are I would advocate, and we're going to read them, there are biblical lines for how much authority kings, and kings being the broad category for a government, so it includes the United States and our legislatures and presidents, and it includes emperors and chairmen and whatever type of head government you have. There's biblical limits for what a king can have. Now, they're pretty broad, and they allow for a lot of hurt and unrighteousness. Mm-hmm. So this isn't the prescription for what a good king would do, but these are the bounds for what kings are allowed to do on the earth. If a government breaks these, they go past these limits that God gives, I would also say that's tyranny. And while you might choose to submit to that and not be sinning, I would say you have a biblical reason to rebel. Now, that doesn't mean let's do it. It just means I think you're allowed to. Kind of like, this is a weird example, but for marriage, I would advocate, and I think a lot of Christians do, although I'm willing to be convinced, that marriage is a contract, right? And the only two things that break it are death and sexual morality. And therefore, you would be justified in getting remarried or divorcing if the person died, right? I think that's obvious, breach of contract, or if the person was sexually immoral. However, and Christ makes this clear to the Pharisees, you aren't required to divorce for sexual morality. So you're justified in doing it, but you're not required to. And sometimes you shouldn't, because it's still workable. I think many times it is workable. So in that same way, a government can breach its contract with its citizens by going over these tyrannical rules that we're about to discuss, but that doesn't necessitate that you rebel against them, right? Mm-hmm. And I could even see, in the marriage case, it being a sin for you to maliciously attack your partner in ways that are unwarranted for their sin. This is clearly generic, so I'm not talking about your specific situation. If they're thinking some scenario I'm not thinking of, but just the base they cheated against you doesn't give you the right to chop off their nose and other things like that. So in the same way, you could rebel against the government in a vicious way and technically be justified because they overwent these tyrannical bounds, but you could end up sinning in your heart because you have malice against evil, unjustified hate in doing it, and you're using the righteous tyrannical thing as an excuse. So let's go over that category of tyranny.
And you have 1 Samuel 8 right there.
Yes, so I'll continue talking. So 1 Samuel 8 is where Samuel, the prophet, or the judge, I should say, is with the people of Israel, and they're demanding a king. Give us a king to rule over us and to fight wars for us and all the good things, other great things that kings do. Give us fire hydrants and other things that governments do. So Samuel, of course, under the direction for the Lord, warns the people of Israel, and he sets out the curses. They are curses, but the bounds of which a king will do to Israel, and there are things that the Lord is not going to help them for when they happen, which to me, and this is arguable, but to me, this is the upper end. All the worst things that a king can do to you and is allowed to do to you within his God-given authority. So they're not good to you or to the nation, but they are allowed by God. And here they are, and they're pretty extreme. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. He said, "This will be the manner of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them with his chariots and horses to run in front of his chariots. He will appoint some for himself as commanders of thousands and of 50s, and others to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and to equip his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and grape harvest and give it to his officials and servants. And he will take your maidservants and manservants and your best cattle and donkeys and put them to his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will beg for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you on that day.
I have to say, no one takes my vineyards. No one lays a hand on my grapes.
Well, apparently this king would. I wouldn't advocate for a king. So you can see that those are things that we would consider, we would probably call tyrannical today, but I don't think they are. I think they're an unrighteous king. Like, for example, if the government today asked for 1/10 of your wealth, because that's when it says he will take a 1/10 of your flocks. That would be like a 10% wealth tax, not just an income tax. Now, there is an income tax here, too. And he says 1/10 of your grape and grain harvests. That's on income, so we can equate that to income tax. But he also says he's entitled to up to 1/10 of your flocks, so your sitting wealth, right? Your standing wealth. So if the United States currently gave you a 10% wealth tax, even if it was just a one time, we would say, tyranny, tyranny. But by this standard, now maybe by another, there's a third category of tyranny that I'll go over. But by this standard, it's not tyrannical. It's bad. It's unrighteous. I don't think it's good for the economy. There's a lot of things to say about that. But the king is entitled to be able to do that, right or wrong. And the same goes for drafting. I mean, there's a lot of things that are controversial today that people would call tyrannical. For example, he's able to take your sons and appoint them to his own chariots and have them run for his chariots and make some of them commanders of his troops. Here's the king. He's allowed to draft sons for war. And so today, there are people who flee the draft, like when Vietnam, because we don't believe it was a fair war, wasn't a just war. You might be right? There might be a stupid war, and it might be unrighteous that the government is drafting your sons for it in whatever ways they are. But I don't think it is tyrannical by this standard. It's bad, probably, depending on the war, of course, but I think it's bad. So say Vietnam is bad. Kind of think it wasn't that wise. The draft was still biblically allowed. It wasn't tyrannical for the government to draft our sons, which people don't like. Nobody likes a draft, and that's why Samuel's warning Israel. Like, nobody likes this. So just warning you, that's what they're going to do. And more than that, and more than our government does, you'll take your daughters and make them be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. So not only for war, right? So war is like a kind of necessary thing you think of, not always, but necessary thing you think of. And maybe the cooks and bakers would be supporting the war. Maybe you could make that adjustment. But perfumers, surely
for war,
yes. Sure, that's not for war. So I think we could say here, especially when it goes down to say he'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to the servants. He can take your stuff, not only your stuff like your land and your wealth, but also your kids. Not just for war, for a temporary thing, but also just in general to make him a servant.
Just for fun.
For fun. So that would be indentured servitude, slavery here, which we ban in this country, right? And many countries ban it too. But you can see that I wouldn't call it tyrannical for the government to enslave its citizens, which is pretty controversial because I think that's like against the human rights code, right? But here, it's not good. It's not a good thing for the government to do, but here it is allowed without being tyranny.
I will have to emphasize too that I see it as this is like the most extreme, because what Samuel is saying, he's saying to me the worst case scenario to dissuade the people. Don't ask for a king, otherwise this is gonna happen. So this is not like a king is commanded to charge 10% of this and that, but this is saying like this should be outrageous to the audience. That's what it's getting at. Like, he can do it. It's not good. It should be outrageous. But then they wanted the king anyways.
Yep. So. And the next line, I didn't read it, but it says, nonetheless, the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. All right. Cool. Well, I warned you, right? And we do it today. Just quick note. Probably won't talk about it in the future, but in case you woke up and don't know the U.S. tax code, we charge way more than 10%, and you pay way more than 10% in taxes, and that was considered a curse. Now, we don't pay 10% wealth tax, so there is something to say about that. But we might in the future. Who knows? Who wins presidency, and it's been in the cards. And probably 10% wealth tax for some of us would be equivalent to the taxes we pay. So in any case, we currently are at least at the limit of, if not we're over, this tyrannical limit for taxes. Now, like I said at the beginning, It doesn't necessitate like let's get the pitchforks now, but I do think it is tyranny by our government to do that kind of thing.
I would rather take the Roman tax, which was 1%.
Would you? You'd rather pay less than more? Yeah. So, yep.
3% in times of war. It was pretty wild back then, but nonetheless, I'll take that.
Now, that is a wealth tax, just for the record.
Yes,
so it's not an income tax; it's a wealth tax, but it is less than you'd expect.
Right.
And I have another thing. So I've got another one from Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
This is a prophetic episode of the Lord's, because Deuteronomy, of course, is written by Moses to the people of Israel when they're in exile before they enter Israel. So before Judges, before Samuel. And the Lord predicts that they will ask for a king and that it will be a curse. But here's some of the things he has to say about that. And these are restrictions on the king. So this is less about the curses that the king will bring, which Samuel talks about, but this is more about the restrictions on the king. So he says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the other nations around me. You're going to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Appoint a king from your brothers. You are not to bring a foreigner and set him over you, or not somebody that's not of your people. However, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or to send the people back to Israel to acquire Egypt to acquire many horses. For the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. Must not acquire for himself many wives, so that his heart won't go astray. He must not acquire very large amounts of silver and gold for himself. When he is seated on his royal throne, he is to write a copy of the instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It is to remain with him, and he is to read from it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe all the words of this instruction, and to do these statutes. So, a couple key points I'm going to put there. If you know your biblical kings, just for the record, Solomon did like the opposite of all these things. I don't know about writing the law. He may have done that, doesn't say. But he certainly acquired for himself a ridiculous amount of wives and wealth and chariots and horses. So when you're reading through the description of Solomon, know that the writers... probably writing post-Solomon, and are meaning to show you, hey, they're not just describing what Solomon did. I think the writers, especially in Chronicles, certainly, which was well past when Solomon's time was, they're definitely saying Solomon was making mistakes here. He was acquiring for himself tons of wealth. They even make the point, I think in both First Kings and in First Chronicles, to say that when he built his own palace versus the Temple of Solomon, Temple of the Lord, it was bigger and more expensive and took longer. Like he had more emphasis on his own wealth than on the stuff of the Lord. So while Solomon was a wise king, he wasn't perfectly wise, and we can all learn a lesson from that. In any case, here's the other restrictions on a king that weren't for Samuel. The government is not to acquire vast sums of wealth that they aren't using. So they're not to amass like a gigantic treasury for no reason. They're not to get tons of weapons of war, the horses from Egypt, and they're not to acquire many wives. That's really king specific. I don't know that we could. I suppose alliances, because wives are used for alliances. So maybe you could say they're not to make many alliances with other nations. We could say that.
Marriages back then were not happy marriages. Marriages until really recently, 19th or even 20th century. So, in the nobility, like the common people, you could marry whoever you want. I understand, but with the nobility, it was I remember you watch all the same historical channels that I do. All the marriages between kings and nobles were for political alliances between different nations. Rarely were they for happy.
No, they can't be for love. Like I'm sure Solomon had wives that were not for political reasons at all. He had 300 concubines, like 200 something wives. So I'm sure some of those were not for alliances, but typically they're for alliances in the nobility, and therefore it's not to entangle yourself in a bunch of alliances. And again, just to quickly quip the United States, I think the United States is a great country. We have a lot of good. We've been blessed by God for a lot of righteous things. However, notice we're not perfect, and nor is our design, because we have many alliances. We're like allied with more than 2/3 of the world right now. We have a negative treasury, but that's kind of a technicality. We have large amounts of wealth in the government just stationed there for kind of no reason. And we have by far the largest military in the world. So take that many horses for himself verse and explode it, because we're stronger than Egypt was comparatively. We have maybe that's arguable, but we certainly have chariots, we have tanks and boats and planes galore. So we're not really holding to this level of restraint that God requires for a king.
Well, Egypt couldn't deploy its armies with the snap of a finger in any place in the world like we.
Yes. Yep. Now, well, we do have a restriction on foreigners leading us, so I guess that's something. I don't think most countries don't have a restriction like that, believe it or not. But the U.S. expressly says it has to be a natural-born citizen. So, sorry, Sebastian. Can't be king of the United States. I'll have to be king instead.
And I'll be viceroy.
Viceroy, yeah, I'll point that. All right, so we've gone through tyrannical government, its restrictions in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Probably could talk about. Do you want any examples of countries that have overreached their authority, just to give some meat to the bones here? It's not just all in theory. Times that governments in history have done something bad, tyrannical.
Well, for example, the taxation, you could say what led to the French Revolution. Yeah. It was tax and tax and tax and tax. The king of France wouldn't let they wouldn't take the assembly seriously. I'm forgetting them in French right now, but the legislature,
the States General.
Yes, that one. And the people had to meet in another place because they weren't listened to, even though obviously the law was created for the legislator to be sure that people are represented in government. Ignoring that, increasing taxes on wealth and also income. People were starving, and that led to the revolution because of all the drastic expenses that France had incurred in that time period. That'd be one. That'd be on one example. The taxation, the injustice, the overreach into the people that they're supposed to protect. Another one that we're arguing a little bit before the podcast, if it really counts as tyranny, but I would say it's pretty much tyranny in a different sense. In the Ottoman Empire, the movement, the deportation, and often systematic execution of ethnic minorities such as Greeks, or Armenians, or Arab Christians there. I would say that was an overreach from the Ottoman government, because under Islamic law, which is what they had, the Sharia, Armenians and Greeks and Christians in the Middle East were dhimmi. Dhimmi were protected people, and the government is obligated by the law of Islam to protect the life, property, and religion, believe it or not, of that person, as long as that person is loyal to the state and pays the jizya, which is a higher tax for non-Muslims. So notice the property too. So, but after there even was a constitution, 1876, the Ottoman government tried to pass a legislature and be sure that the Armenians and Christians were heard, proper representation in the millet system, to be sure that they all have their own governments. Nonetheless, after the Young Turks took over, they started and you can say, out of fear of the Russians, they said, let's just move the Armenians away from the border. Well, if you had just moved them, while I would see that as a breach because they have property, you're just removing them from their property and probably seizing their wealth along the way too. Shooting them or starving them on the way, that's definitely an overreach. You're not protecting their lives at that point. You're just seeing them as either an enemy, even though they're your citizens. So
when you bring up a good point, and the reason we were even debating this, so clearly we all we think it's unrighteous, it's evil, we judge by God, the Armenian genocide, right? That's what normally that's called, because they stole land, it was unrighteous, it hurt these people. So even if none of them died, it was bad. And of course, many of them died incidentally going through the desert, and then also explicitly by big shootings. There's a lot of denial and weird other things with the Ottoman government. I don't know. I think the facts would bear that the Ottoman government meant to just steal their property and move them because they were worried that they would side with the Russians because they were at war with the Russians at the time, and the Russians are Christian, the Ottomans weren't, and the Armenians are Christian, so they thought it'd be a problem. So I think at the highest echelons of government, there may have been some, well-intentioned, though I still, again, think it's unrighteous to steal all their property, no compensation, all that type of stuff. But there may not have been the want to massacre from the highest levels, but surely on the ground level, these people were slaughtered in mass often. So I think that constitutes it's a sin just to steal their property, right? Because it's greed and stealing and a lot of things. I think it's within the realms of the king. It's the unrighteous kind of king, but within the realms of the king to steal their property, to force them to do things, to force them to move even. I think that those are within the realm of the king. That's why I was like, is that really tyranny? But this brings up the third kind of tyranny, and I think this is pretty important. So it's not, I don't know that it's necessarily tyranny against what God's restrictions for kings are. Besides the killing part. Killing part's well, I don't know. I mean, it's just randomly. It's a sin, so they will be judged for it. So I think that would be yes. If they're killing their own people for a crime that doesn't warrant death, that's unjust according to God's law. That's something we haven't really talked about. But so we've got the restraints for the king. We've got the sins, like if they're asking you to sin. I don't know that they were asking the Armenians to sin.
They weren't forcing them to convert, no.
Weren't forcing them to convert or like do other sinful things, but they were asking them to die. So there might be some argument there. But anyways, the real thing that it's a breach of, and I would say this is also the smallest level of tyranny, but I would still say it is tyranny, is if the state contradicts its own laws.
Which is what the Ottoman government did.
And that's the U.S. Revolution, in the American Revolution, the American Independence Movement, whatever you want to call it. It was predicated on the third level of tyranny, believe it or not. So as much as we didn't like the stamp tax and the taxes and taxation without representation and all that type of stuff, that didn't breach biblical tyranny. And I think the founding fathers were pretty astutely aware of what the Bible allowed for governments to do, but they were very minded in this third level of tyranny, and that is what the state had already said it was going to do and what the laws and the books said. For example, to take a biblical example, King Darius, when he sets that law for not being able to pray for a certain period of days, I think it's like 30 days, he realizes, oh, that's going to end up hurting Daniel, or when they arrest Daniel, he's like, oh, snap. That's Daniel we're talking about. I don't know, take out him. But he can't undo the law because he said it. And that's the way authority works. Like if he just undid his own law, it'd be unjust, and it would be worse than if he had rescued Daniel, in his opinion. I think, arguably, but I think that's the way it should work. Same thing as for Xerxes, actually, to keep on the Persian thing. He gave that law to allow people to kill the Jews and steal their property, because Haman, is that his name? Forgetting my Bible names, but his advisor that hated the Jews, hated Mordecai, wanted to hurt the Jews, so he had the king pass that law. And the king, Xerxes, didn't undo the law. He passed another law that said that Jews are allowed to kill anybody who tries to take their property and murder them without mercy and no retribution if they're trying to attack. So essentially a self-defense law, which is kind of an advocacy for self-defense laws here in the U.S. But in any case, those two kings show you that they're holding to that third version of tyranny. They're trying to avoid that third version of tyranny, which is contradicting themselves and their own laws. And so the Ottoman government certainly was disregarding its own laws. And the United States, or the 13 colonies, were saying that the British were committing this third act of tyranny, this third tier of tyranny, in that the British had said that many of the 13 colonies, not all of them, but many of them had their own state legislatures, their own state constitutions and other things like that the British had agreed when they chartered them. For example, Massachusetts. And they chartered Massachusetts as a colony. They said, yes, you can have your own legislature. Like Massachusetts presented England with, here's how we want to govern ourselves. We'll still be ultimately subject to you. We'll still fight in your wars and all that type of stuff. But we want to govern ourselves, be able to appoint our own governor. But when push came to shove, King George III appointed his own governor of Massachusetts because he was worried about rebellion and didn't like the fact that they were being nosy and protesting and all that type of stuff. And Massachusetts said, we had an agreement where you had agreed, the law says that you'll respect our legislatures, but you're disregarding your own law. That's tyrannical. You're a tyrant. And that's part of the emphasis for the Declaration of Independence, because the troops were sent in after that by England to occupy Massachusetts, and they were going against their own law. So, whether you agree with that or not, I think the third level of tyranny is an appropriate tyrannical stage, right? They're disregarding their own law. For example, if the United States even if it's not a sinful thing. For example, if we have a tax law in place, right,
Mm-hmm.
and it has certain loopholes or whatever, if for whatever reason the president said, oh, you, Michael, have to pay, you don't get that loophole, but everybody else does. I think that would be tyranny unless they passed a law that said the president has the right to do that kind of willy-nilly choosing of who pays and who doesn't. But right now, under the current laws, the president doesn't have that right. So this is kind of a weird example. But if they broke the U.S. laws right now, I would say that's tyranny, even if it's not a sin. Like the president has the right to tax me. It's just he doesn't in the U.S. Constitution.
So 3 levels then.
Yep, 3 levels, and we've gotten some examples, and those are kind of recent. I think you've got like Mao Zedong, right, forces people to reject Christ. There you go, straight sin, right? There's tyranny. Same with Stalin, reject Christ. There you go, tyranny. And not spread the gospel. Both those things don't spread the gospel, and that's tyranny. So we've got many levels of tyranny everywhere. Lots of examples. So we've gone through what tyranny is, what our obligation is to obey the government, when our restrictions are not to obey the government. Those 3 levels of tyranny, some examples of tyranny. Now let's talk about the U.S. Constitution. We've already touched on a couple of things, but Sebastian, maybe I'll give it to you first. What part of the U.S. Constitution do you think is actually in breach of these tyrannical laws, if there is any? I guess I'm setting you up here, but
A breach.
Is there any part of U.S. law that you think is a breach of this? We've already talked about taxes, right?
I would say the one that really sticks out, because I recently pointed this out, that it was 10%. I mean, not just now, but recently, meaning a month ago, never really paid much attention to it, but probably taxes would be something in the U.S. And U.S. laws and state laws that go against biblical law. The draft, I think it's okay. I don't like it. No one likes it, but clearly it can be done, especially if it's for defense.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned an interesting example of what could be done. For example, let's say that someone wants to build a wall on the border with Canada. Let's change things up a little bit on Canada.
And make Canada pay for it.
Yes, and make Canada pay for it, okay? So, if you own land near the border, the government can purchase that land from you.
Eminent domain, yeah, which is in the Constitution. So this isn't even just a obscure state or government law. It's within the founding document itself, the right to eminent domain, which I would argue, I don't know, because for the first Samuel quote says that he can take your best vineyards and stuff, right? So perhaps that's allowed within the realm of a king.
But it's outrageous.
I mean, it is outrageous, right? But it would be within the realm of a king. Like we were talking before the podcast about this too. When Ahab and Jezebel are kings of Israel and are king and queen of Israel, and they want that neighboring vineyard for themselves, right? They don't just take it via eminent domain. They offer to buy it, but the guy says no. Whereas in the U.S., you can't refuse an eminent domain request. They pay you, thankfully, but you can't refuse it. You can't say, no, I won't submit to this purchase. That's the whole point of eminent domain. They seize the land and they give you the money. It seems like Ahab and Jezebel didn't have that ability, or they just didn't want to exercise it, which is kind of odd considering they were already tyrants and, bad people. It could have been just for image sake, like they didn't want to be seen as the one seizing land. But it could be that they felt that this was a restriction on their power, and maybe it was a law thing, like it wasn't in the law books yet that the kings could seize land, and so they couldn't and didn't, because it would have been breaching that third level of tyranny. Even if Samuel explains that kings would do this, it wasn't yet in the law books of Israel. But of course, they go and have the guy murdered and take it anyways. But it's kind of odd that they don't just seize it by themselves if they had that right. So you could say that, I don't know, there might be an argument for eminent domain not being allowed, but I kind of think that 1 Samuel allows it.
I don't like it anyways.
Yeah. Libertarians hate eminent domain. I don't know, it seems reasonable to me that the government would be able to seize the land on the border for the sake of national security. I mean, there's certainly many misuses of eminent domain, which is why people get upset with it. Like, oh, we want to build a nuclear plant in your backyard, so we're going to buy your backyard and put a nuclear plant there. And you're like, what? But I think the government has the right to do it, even if it's bad.
I just have complaints, but maybe you have also some complaints of your own.
Well, we have plenty. I mean, there's endless list of complaints about the government, right? Because it's not a perfect government, as there will never be until the return of Christ. But I actually want to strike at, I think, the heart of a lot of Americanism and love for the Constitution. I like the Constitution. I think it's a wise document, mostly because of its understanding of limited government, which maybe we should talk about the good before we talk about the bad here. The Bible clearly advocates for two things. One, the restriction of government power, right?
Mm-hmm.
But not just the bounds of government, but also the principle that people are inherently evil, right? That's a big theme in God's word, is that because we fall into sin, our hearts are naturally wicked and our judgments naturally perverse, and therefore we won't judge well because of sin. So the founders and other advocates of limited government recognized this biblical fact, this biblical truth, in that people are wicked, not naturally good, and that unlike what the previous president Barack Obama said, the arc of history is long. He said the arc of history is long, but eventually curves towards good. We say no, the arc of history is long. It does by the Lord's hand, but if it was just left to man's hand, it would curve towards evil. So we say, and the founders said, we shouldn't give men power as far as we can help it. So we're going to give them just enough that's necessary. So less than the Lord allows for kings to give. We're going to restrict. That's why we don't have a king in the United States. We have a president who's less than a king, depending on what he's doing, I guess. But technically on paper, he's less than a king. And that's because they agreed with, yes, okay, so say these things, these points from 1 Samuel and Deuteronomy 17, these are restrictions on what a king could do, but we want even less because we understand that people are evil. We want the smallest government possible because people will abuse each other. So we have just enough to punish evildoers. That's kind of all the government should be doing, and to keep the borders intact. That's the original design of the Constitution, and I think that's wise, biblically wise, not just wise because I grew up in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And so I was talking before too, for the reasoning is, as you were saying, limit power, because the people are likely going to be in authority, are going to be fallen people.
Mm-hmm.
Probably more than likely, but someone there is
even if you have a true blue Christian at the helm, they're still not perfect. They're still not King Jesus, and so they'll still make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Right, and as we talked about in our previous episode, which you should totally check out, there is evil within all of us. Talk about the soul and the body.
Mm-hmm.
From Jeremiah, you quoted, it was, the heart is desperately wicked, who can understand it? And then from Romans, said, no one is righteous, not even one. Probably all know that, heard it hundreds of times. No one who understands, no one who seeks God, all have turned away, and they have together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. So, Jew and Gentile, both. No human, unless redeemed by God, can do good. Thus, with that in mind, why would you want to give all these abilities, these powers, these duties to a person with this description? It only seems that disaster could come from that. Something terrible. Ahab and Jezebel murdering someone just for the sake of expanding their own garden because the vineyard was right next to the palace. You murder someone just so you can have a bigger garden. This guy's your king. Why is he king? Why is she here? Why is Jezebel here? Same also, the Ottoman government. You have this fear that the Armenians in the border are going to join the Russians. You are accusing them of something that hasn't happened yet. You're punishing them for something they haven't done at the moment. I would say haven't done yet. So let's kill them. Let's get them out of there. Let's kill them too. For other examples too, in the Reformation, all the killings in both sides. So let's not give government such the ability to inflict so much harm on a person. Let's take that away as much as possible, giving just the bare minimum to keep justice and maintain the peace.
Yeah. So that's all the kisses I'll give to the U.S. Constitution. I like I'm born American, so I like it, and I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. So let's not. My next comments that are going to detract from it, don't take that as some attack on limited government and a lot of the principles of the Constitution. But let me attack the dear First Amendments, the Bill of Rights. We all love the Bill of Rights. First Amendment to the Bill of Rights is that the government shall do a lot of things, but one of them is not make a law regarding the establishment of religion. And that is to say, the federal government cannot establish an official religion of the United States that the government controls. Okay? Because a lot of countries had done that, and the U.S. didn't want it because we, first of all, had a lot of different churches in the states anyways, like Catholics were in Maryland and Episcopalians are in Virginia and other things like that. So we couldn't really decide in a church even if we wanted to. And then secondly, we saw a lot of the problems with sacral systems, those that have this church and the state are the same thing, right? The king is the head of the church, like in England right now, the Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. There's problems with that. And even in biblical law, the king was not allowed to be high priest. There are some exceptions, like Melchizedek was high priest and king, and David wasn't high priest, but he did do some things like the high priest, like go and enter bread that he wasn't supposed to eat, and other things like that. But remember that I think they are. I don't just think they are exceptions. And David wasn't the high priest at the time, and kings like Uzziah were punished for trying to mix the two. King Uzziah tried to go and perform the sacrifices in the temple in lieu of the high priest, and he was cursed with leprosy for it. So it was not something to be mixed. It wasn't something prescribed to be mixed. And so I would say, yeah, biblical to not want the government, U.S. or Israel or otherwise, to be the one that controls and does the church functions. Okay? And countries have done it, but it's bad, and it leads to bad things. So I think that's the good side of the First Amendment. However, I think it goes too far in that it doesn't just say the United States can't create a specific church. It says it can't create a law regarding the establishment of religion, which means that we cannot do a religious requirement for government office, for example. Now, that sounds very un-American because the First Amendment restricts it. Mm-hmm. I should also bring up a weird nuance. There are some who would claim, and I might be one of them, that the Bill of Rights was written for the federal government, not for state governments, meaning that it would allow states to establish religions, but not the federal government. And that's something that, for example, the Articles of Confederation, during that time, the brief time between the Constitution and the U.S.'s independence, states had their own official religions. Like Virginia was officially Episcopalian, and I think Maryland was officially Catholic, I think. In any case, that was allowed under the Articles of Confederation, and it was Marbury versus Madison, I think it was the Supreme Court case that said that the Bill of Rights applies to states too, not just the federal government. So it's a Supreme Court ruling, meaning that it wasn't super clear that these applied to states. So you could argue that the Supreme Court ruling is wrong and these only apply to the states. But I like a lot of the Bill of Rights, so I would like it to apply to the states. So I would argue that it applies to the states, and therefore this establishment of the religion clause applies to the states. And I don't think it should. From the Bible, this is my argument, the king is required to write for himself the law of God and then treasure it in his heart and keep it all the time in front of the church. And I think that the U.S. leaders at least should be able to, if not required to, be explicitly Christian. Now, it doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't guarantee that he's a real Christian, right? Mm-hmm. And you'd probably end up with, perverted system where they just take the oath in the Bible and they say they're Christian just to lead, and there's a lot of empty-headed non-Christian Christians up in leadership. So I understand that. It's not like end-all be-all, this will make us a Christian nation. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that it would be more righteous for us to be an officially Christian nation. Now, I would advocate for that being as broad as possible so that you don't end up with a sacral system. So you have a very broad Christian terminology, right? That you agree that maybe the Trinity and that Jesus rose from the dead and is real, and that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. But I mean, you can see that there's plenty of Americans, not just the atheists, but also Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and liberal Christians that would hate that establishment. So I don't know that we'd actually get this passed. But in any case, I'm just saying, I think this is actually a flaw in the U.S. Constitution. I think we should be allowed to establish religion, not a state-run church, but a Christian established nation, so that you can't have churches that are not Christian.
Mm-hmm. And it will be a very, very delicate thing to do, because even our places that might be dear to all of us, like for Lutherans, Saxony, where Luther was, Sacred Society, Denmark, Sweden, Sacred Societies. If you were a Danish citizen, you were Lutheran. Now, Danish equals Lutheran. If you were even Reformed people, for Calvin, if you lived in Geneva or in other Swiss cantons that were Reformed, Swiss equals Reformed. I understand there were Swiss Catholics in other parts, but let's just say Swiss just for Geneva, so I don't say Genevans or whatever they would be. Swiss equals Reformed. That's when the Anabaptists came off with their head. Not, well, drowning, but executed nonetheless. Do we consider Anabaptist Christians? Absolutely. Absolutely. Reformed people? Yes, of course. However, the definitions were so tight that it led to the execution of, I would say, brothers and sisters in Christ. We would probably be executed by
We were Anabaptists by their definition.
Yes. So, no, I would say, for me, I would say it requires a lot of delicacy and a lot of mediation from a lot of groups. And yeah, you do want it to be as broad as possible, including, just you said, Trinitarians. That sounds basic. Bible is real. Some might scoff at why we even bring up the Bible. There are people that don't believe the Bible is real.
Plenty, yes.
And as we talked about in the atheism in Europe, or liberalism, Christian liberalism in Europe too, and in the US. And baptism doesn't. I don't know. Should we throw that one? Baptism doesn't save you.
We're not cooking up a thing right now for the amendment to the Constitution, but understand this: right now, I think the Democratic Party is advocating that we undo the Second Amendment. So I could see anybody undoing the First Amendment and establishing some terrible religion, or like establishing atheism as the official religion or something like that. So just because it's in the Constitution doesn't mean that we're immune to it. So just because we would remove it from the Constitution doesn't mean that it would necessarily happen. For example, if we didn't have that clause of Amendment 1 that says that disallows the establishment of religion by the government, it wouldn't mean that the United States would have established a religion. I just think it's an undue restriction. I think states, honestly, this is the way I think we should do it. I think state by state, they should be allowed to set its own rules. Mm-hmm. And so if there's one crazy state that decides to pick the wrong rules, right?
Mormonism,
yeah. Yes, like Utah, right? That they would suffer for it, right? And then you would leave. I don't know that it should be disallowed. Maybe there's the advocacy. There could be the argument that as federal government, we should outlaw all false religion. Anyways, but you can see this is it doesn't sound American, does it? It sounds like, oh, that's tyranny, baby. Like but it's not. It's not by definitions of God's law. And that's where I think we really need to separate Americanism and Westernism, or whatever you're going to call it, from God's law, because God's law is different. Western law is based on it, but it's different.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking now, Josiah was praised when he found the book of the law. Mm-hmm. And then the writers later go back to saying, "Oh yeah, remember that good King Josiah who restored the law and the worship of God, of Yahweh, not just all the other Baal, Moloch, Asherah, you name it." So there was a praise for the king for bringing back religion, the worship of Yahweh, good religion to Israel, versus just letting the people be. So there's something to be said about that. What do you think about then Emperor Theodosius when he made Christianity official religion of the Roman Empire? Like, do you see that as similar to what the U.S. would be, or what do you see as different than that?
So no, when Theodosius made it the official religion, he became the head of the church, and every church decision that was made had to pass by the emperorship. And I think that's the problem. And I understand the worries about making a sacral society, and that's why it would be a really sensitive thing. I think you'd probably want, instead of a constitutional amendment that said barring the establishment of religion, I think it would define the doctrines of the Christian faith as broad as we're saying as possible, and that's it. No more. There's no commission for Bible stuff. There's no it doesn't establish a EPA of Bible understandings, right? So you could, I guess, have churches that disregard the Constitution, and it would take a prosecutor to say, hey, you're going against the Constitution, to prosecute you, but there would be no Bureau of Investigation or anything like that for Christian churches, and so therefore you wouldn't be going through the government all the time to get approval on things. And the Roman government, they couldn't logistically micromanaging every single church, but they tried their best. They were trying to be as sacred as possible, so that's where I think it goes wrong.
Enforcing orthodoxy that makes sure everyone's believing the same thing. The Roman government, that's what.
Yeah, now to their credit, they were trying to be broad, but it just wasn't broad enough, in my opinion, right? And that's why they called the whole council of, I'm forgetting the name. The first council.
Nicaea,
yes. That was before Theodosius, of course, but they wanted to get a concise view of what Christianity was so that they could make laws like that. And again, we all can see where it goes bad, but we have to notice, for example, for King Josiah, what other righteous thing he did that we would just gawk at today? He went and killed all the pagan priests, all the fake priests in Israel or in Judah. He killed them all, and then he burned their altars with their bones so that it was desecrated, right? And I think that was counted to him as righteousness. I think I'll stop there, but I think that if we establish religion in the United States, there would be things we could do like that would actually be counted as righteous. Now, am I advocating for killing all our neighbors? No. That's why I say I'll stop there. But that's why I think that you can't biblically advocate for the non-establishment of religion.
All right.
And there you go. That's probably the hottest take I've ever dropped from this podcast. So I'll stop there. Perhaps I'll regret all that. But so the last point is, what do we do now? Okay, so we've talked about all this stuff. Do we, because the United States is breaching the tax thing, for example, or the non-establishment of religion one, do we put on our bike helmets and the pool goggles and the snorkels and fly out in town burning down Wendy's? You smiling at me? You probably know the answer.
I would say no. No. I would say no. Even though they're asking me to do this, even though they're asking me to wear a mask. I'm like,
Tyranny! Tyranny!
Because in my mind, I am not convicted that I am blaspheming against God. This is my personal take, Mike. You can say whatever you want. I am more than happy to comply. If it's say you're my church, just so you can meet, you have to wear a mask. I'm like, okay, sure. I don't feel like I'm blaspheming. I do not think I am breaching any command of God. So I'm like, okay. Taxes, do I like them? Absolutely not. Do I like the idea of draft? No. Defensive war, I understand. Okay, I understand. But offensive war, thanks, but no thanks. And forced labor, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
Taking my vineyards, thanks, but no thanks. For other things, fine, I will. I'll do it. Just don't make me blaspheme. Don't make me murder anyone. I am more amiable in that sense, I would say.
I think for the mask thing and other things like that, or if they were going to take our vineyards, they might be allowed by, I think, pretty clearly by the 1 Samuel clause. I think making you forced laborers also would allow them to force you to wear a mask. I don't think that's a biblical breach. I think what mask wearing or anti-mask advocates would advocate that it's not in the U.S. Constitution or the state constitution is that it allows either of them to force us to wear masks, and they're doing it anyway. So therefore, it's that breach of that third tier of tyranny. I don't know the laws well enough to know if they can do that. I think there's weird laws that allow them to do the quarantine stuff that were there before Corona for a lot of states. So, we have so many laws in this country that it's not entirely surprising that there's some hidden law that gives them the authority to make us wear masks. So whatever. I mean, it's not so offensive to me that I don't really care, but it could be tyranny by that third standard.
Yes.
In any case,
One more thing though, before I forget. Just like how I said many episodes ago, I don't even know how many. If they ban alcohol, and you know I like my wines, I will surrender my wines for the sake of keeping the peace.
what about communion, huh?
Oh, well, in my Baptist church we don't have.
Yeah, I know. I don't really think it's a biblical command to get alcoholic wine, for the record. Now, I do support alcohol wine in communion, though my church doesn't do it either. But I don't know that it would be like disobeying God if they had banned alcohol and not having to have wine. Now, I might think it's a way overreach of government, which it is, and the government doesn't have the right in this country. It would be breaching that third thing of tyranny to say that we can't have alcohol in the church, which is why in Prohibition, for the record, they didn't restrict wine at communion. But I actually don't think it's tyranny.
For guns, I'm like, sure, I would do that too.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a breach of the Second Amendment. So there's their third stage of tyranny. It's also, I think, I'm going to really stretch here, but I kind of think it's lack of love for neighbor to do that kind of thing, because then you can't defend your neighbor
Or your household.
or your household. But I guess you could say the same thing for like if they stole you, like if the king steals you and forces you to work someplace not near your family, you're not really protecting or providing for your family there too, and he has the right to do that. So
They're vulnerable.
yeah. So maybe that's not a very good excuse. But in any case, it's against the Second Amendment in this fine country. So if they told me they haven't changed the amendment, but they are going to restrict guns, I would say, I don't know. See, I think I would have that's one of those situations where I think you have the godly right to resist. However, it's not necessarily worth it. For example, on the taxes thing, I think we do have the right to resist. However, do I want to? Do I want to die or, follow my sword figuratively because they put you in jail or extra tax you, give you tax penalties or whatever for only, if I decided, okay, I'm only going to pay the federal government or in the state government in total 10% because that's the biblical law. They'll come after you, right? And is that worth fighting the government on that? Probably not. The gun one, maybe it is. There's lots of people who say it is, and maybe it is for me. But on taxes, I wouldn't be on the streets because it's just money, right? The gun one is important to me because it's not just the gun, it's not just the property there. I think it has to do with saving lives, and that's why I would advocate. That's why I'd be more prone to resist on that one than taxes, because taxes, I will have enough money, depending on how much taxes they'll give me, but I will have enough money to take care of people and myself and all that, still give tithes to the church and all that. The gun one I feel like is worse than high taxes. In any case, I think you, first of all, go by the leading of the Spirit. We all know that we must rebel if it's the first tier of tyranny, right? If they're asking us to sin, we have to rebel. The other ones are just, the breaches of the other two are just if you want to, kind of like the breach of marriage, if you want to. And I think we only rebel when we think it is a matter of life and death. That's what I would say. So, for example, the Armenians. Am I saying that? Armenians.
Yes.
Mixing up. Too similar. When the Armenians are being persecuted by the Ottomans, and it was Ottoman law, even if, so say they didn't have the dhimmi thing. Say it was just, but they weren't breaching anything. They were totally in their rights to make them move. I would say, I don't care what the Ottomans have to say. Hold on. Let me reverse it. It's that third tier of tyranny, right? So it's under your discretion on whether or not you decide to rebel against the government because they have breached their right. Okay. And you say, this sounds like it's going to kill my whole family or my whole neighborhood or whatever it is. I'm going to disobey because you breached that level of tyranny. So there is a right for you to rebel, and it's worth it because it's a matter of life and death. That's when I would say I would rebel in that. Same with the Holocaust. If you're in a scenario where you think you're going to die and there's tyrannical government, then yeah, and even though it's not a sin for you to obey the government and go die, I would say, yeah, you should resist. And therefore, if this government decides to start rounding up people, I think we should resist. And even for abortion mills, it is legal to get abortions in Minnesota, but I think we have the right to, I think it's worth, and we have the right to protest that happening at the abortion mills.
Even if that gets you arrested.
because it's worth it, right? Life and death.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, so that's kind of my line, is if it's life and death, even if it's not the sin category, like you're not sinning if you don't protest, I think it is worthy of protesting if it's life and death for you or for your neighbors. But if it's just money, I wouldn't protest it. Like, I wouldn't be out there in the streets. Now, I would always vote. I'm all for advocating and debating and arguing and all that type of stuff, but I would not personally protest. I feel it's not very Christian to be ranting against the government for taxes, which, again, they might be tyrannical, but we know that Jesus said, pay Caesar what is Caesar. So I don't know that, like, it might be tyrannical. You might have the right to do it, but clearly the spirit of Christ's words are to pay the money. It's just money.
Keep in mind, he was saying it when it was just 1%.
That's true, right? And so, yeah, it wasn't tyrannical in his day. So perhaps that changes the equation, but in any case, I think it is just money. So unless they were depriving you of food, like the taxes were like Maoist China taxes, where they take all of your food and then they give you none back, then you might resist because it's tyrannical and it's a matter of life and death. But again, that's life and death, not just money.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think that's what we do. So knowing these restrictions, we can determine, okay, that's tyrannical, that's not tyrannical, but that doesn't necessitate action always. I think most of the time it doesn't necessitate action, because most of the time it's going to be a breach of categories 2 or 3. It's most of the time not going to be a breach of number 1. And so it's still a breach. It's still a rightful breach, and you should say something about it and note in your mind, hey, this isn't right. But you can still submit. And that's what we do. So I don't think I don't think it's righteous to riot in the streets for BLM. So say BLM they had government tyranny, like the police force is tyrannically killing people. Now, it's arguable, but say it is. So they have the right to do it. But what exactly they're protesting for, like, reparations, aren't they? They're protesting for a lot of weird stuff. And
many things, yeah.
And I guess it's mixed. That's kind of hard to say, but I think their protesting is unjust. Unjust protesting, because even if they were protesting something righteous, they're not protesting for a specific thing. Usually, they're like, I'm angry, which is not, that's not disobeying the government. That's like just shouting that you're angry. I don't know. This is kind of a mixed message now that I'm giving at the end here, but I don't think that those are grandly justified, mostly because they're not just protesting police brutality. They're mostly protesting, like, capitalism and the patriarchy and robbing stores and other things like that. Like, the restitution for the police killing somebody is not to burn down a Target, because the Target didn't kill that guy.
Nor anyone working for Target.
Even if it was a Target employee, does that
right,
justify burning down the Target? It's not that employee's property, nor is it yours. So that's kind of a tangent, though.
Yep. No. I mean, it is relevant because it is involving something going on now that it is a complaint against authority. You are going out of your way to cause attention, gather attention for a cause. The problem is that their causes, and they're diverse, ranging from reparations to reform the police to patriarchy to
abolish rent, baby.
Abolish rent. I've seen some people that say abolish rent, so yes, I would throw that in there too. And if it was a specific thing that we could evaluate that further, but it is a mismatch of things, and most of them, the police want. I mean, I could see calling for justice. I understand, you want to reform. You want to reform society for the sake of, in their minds, to get better justice.
Maybe they say it's life and death, right? Because they're saying it's a Holocaust of black people or whatever. Right,
and then that's a matter of getting in the conversation. Is it really life or death? But have that clear message, and that where we're getting at is very confused. It's very confused. It's
very confused movement, and so for each one of us personally, we have to determine why we're doing it. And if it's not a breach of tyranny, then I don't think you're justified at all. And even if it is a breach of tyranny, it might not be worth it. I don't think it's worth it in a lot of times. In any case, I think the conclusion to all this is that ultimately, earthly governments are always going to fail. And we're all of us, even the from the Antifa member to the most staunch conservative to Christians everywhere, we are all waiting for a righteous, perfect government. Though we don't have the perfect idea of exactly what that will be, we know who that will be, and that's the Lord Jesus, who will come down and reign for 1,000 years, regardless of your view of what that 1,000 years is. He's either reigning now or will reign, or whatever your view is. He will reign on this earth 1,000 years, and his justice will outshine all the justice of other nations. His rule, he'll rule unruly people, the same sinner people, with a better hand, the perfect hand that the U.S. can't do, that China doesn't do, that England doesn't do, that Russia doesn't do, that no future government or past government has ever or will ever do. He is the one we await. He's the perfect government for an unruly people, and of course, for the eventual new heavens and new earth. So that's why we've found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening. I've been Michael Bland behind the machine, and to my...
Just say right. Yeah.
It's my right, but it's the screen's left.
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
Thanks for listening. If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you can go to foundcause.podbean.com and see all of our episodes there for your listening pleasure. Download them and watch them at 2x speed. Those are just the audio, though. If you want to see the video, you can go to youtube.com and search Found Cause, or go to facebook.com/Found Cause and see all our videos there. You can also find us on iTunes and Amazon and wherever else you have found your podcasts. Until next week when we talk about something completely different. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's completely different. Bye-bye.
Bye.